Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Property Trio. We're delighted to be getting together again and recording, and Dave has a new PC, so his audio quality is stunning.
Yeah, it sounds much better to me.
It does.
I don't love changing my tech over, so I'd had my Lenovo laptop for about 7 years, but yeah, I've moved on and it's been pretty smooth.
I'm glad. I'm glad, Dave. No more Castle Grayskull. Snake Mountain. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing well. I am on the same tech, but everyone loves the FM voice so far, so I'll stick with that.
Yeah.
You've got your beard happening. There's a bit of Ed Sheeran. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, I'm about to. I'm pretty much shutting down the face for Christmas. I've got no presentations or any need to be anything other than
you're road
absolute
tripping.
scruff. Yeah.
Oh, you'll have a good time. Well, we've got an important episode to record today, and this one is where we are held accountable in 12 months' time, because we're getting together to discuss our predictions for, what the leading indicators are suggesting we can expect for 2024. And in 12 months' time, we'll replay these and we'll go through what we got right, what we got wrong. And speaking of which, in a month's time, we'll be going through Dave's and Pete's and my predictions from this time last year. And Mike, I know you'll be dancing on a grave, but just remember you're part of the trio now and your time will come.
Yeah, but that's sort of like I'm going to make some bold statements today and then just have to deal with them in a year's time. And that's so far in the future that I often make decisions for future me, like just days in advance. And I just think, that's future me to worry about. And then, I normally always
like when you drink
it.
too much red wine with me at the Australia Club.
Yes.
Yeah,
that is a
problem.
That is a past Mike dumping on future Mike issue.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's kick this off, and I'm glad that you're going to be brave. I will start with you, Dave. What do you think the market will do?
So I think we'll see value growth of about 2 to 7% nationally next year. I think the market will be weighed down by Melbourne and Sydney as they're starting to move into negative territory, and I think there'll be some good buying opportunities in Melbourne and Sydney for the first 3 to 6 months, but because they are about 50% of the overall Australian property market, I think they'll hold it back. And so it's a bit similar to 2022, really. I actually saw those predictions that Anne-Marie sent through, and so it's almost close to a carbon copy of the 2022 predictions and what played out. I think rental growth will outstrip value growth. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, we'll get to that. Rents and vacancy rates. Yeah.
I tend to agree with you, Dave, and I like sometimes having a polar opposite view with you to keep it fun. But on this one, I think that you're right. Melbourne and Sydney will slow down the pace of our national median house price growth, in my view. And I know anecdotally a lot of agents locally are talking about really strong volumes. And so I've spent, the last few months nagging them to bring some sales forward from next year and let me have a crack. And a couple have, but a lot of them have said, no, the vendor really wants to have their day in the sun and they'd like to enjoy, what next year brings. But the problem with lots of vendors coming on stream at the one time is your supply and demand ratio can be tilted. And if that happens, we can expect some good buying conditions. And when I say good buying conditions, maybe a buyer's market for the first few months. And nobody really likes that because we might see values slipping back or we might just see them holding. But what I do think will be a bit of a surprise for next year. I think that Perth, Adelaide and Queensland will continue at their strong pace. And I'm reluctant to say that Tassie and Northern Territory will, purely because of the number of sales that we're talking. It's too volatile a data set to draw strong conclusions from in terms of market growth. Mike, what about you?
I was just kind of thinking that now would be a good time to say, you're breaking up. Just avoid this because I talked a big game before, but I'm almost certainly going to regret it. I did a little video about my 2024 predictions and sort of prefaced it by saying the only person that I have confidence in will get it right Chris Gray, because he said it'll either go up, go down, or stay the same. Like, that's his prediction. Because I suppose, his philosophy is blue chip Sydney, who gives a crap what happens in the market? It'll always do all right. So, it's a crystal ball thing, isn't it? And we're talking about the market. But I said that the economist broadly, as presented, I think, by the Fin Review, said between 1.5 and 8%. That was kind of the range. And I think Louis Christopher was the 6 to 8%. He was the only one that was given a range. And I said that I expect property prices to either test or break the upper limit of that range. So I'm a glass half full guy for property in 2024. I expect, I suppose if you look at that, I'm probably saying, 7 to 9%, which is pretty strong. I worry about being incorrect with that because of the things that you mentioned with Sydney and Melbourne being such a big sort of gravitational force. They could slow that down. I think it's outside of those locations where we will see some of those bigger numbers. I expect that Perth will probably have another at least 6 to 12 months in it, perhaps, before it drops right down. And Brisbane is about the same. Adelaide, I think, is probably about to kick off a harder run. It seems to be a little bit slower, and I'm expecting Hobart to potentially bounce back a little bit as well. So it'll be unusual across the country. I don't think we will be talking about one property market like we kind of did post-COVID. And even now, places like Canberra have smashed that, right? Like, it's completely different. Canberra, Hobart, they're very, very different. But yeah, I'm optimistic about the market in general. I think it's going to be a year in two halves. Now, that whether they're halves or eighths or whatever, but what I'm getting at is interest rates. I think whenever we get to the point where either it's a line ball call or we get the first cut, I think sentiment will go through the roof. I think borrowing capacity will start to sort of catch up to people's idea that they want to get into property, and that's where we'll see the majority of the movement. Now, that might not happen until late 2024, in which case we might see a stagnant sort of market for the first 6 or 8 months, and then we get all the growth in the back end. So I think you're right. There will be a period of a buyer's market potentially in the new year. I'm encouraging anybody that can to buy sooner rather than later.
Yeah. I like that you've segmented the year into two, Mike, because I've maintained that I think we'll have some good buying conditions early next year in Melbourne. Not necessarily the regions. They seem to be working under enough steam now to not be losing traction. They came off a little bit after COVID lockdowns finished, and people stopped wanting to escape the city. But I think that the chicken and egg issue could kick into gear if vendors early next year aren't getting the prices that they want. They shut up shop. They tend to sit back and wait, and they adopt that philosophy of I'll sell when I can see that I can buy, and then when the stock transactions grind to a halt, we then see the same issue that we experienced early last year when we just didn't have enough stock and prices were moving purely because of that undersupply. It'd be interesting. Cool. Okay, well, we've got another one to tackle. I'd like to ask you, Dave, top performers. Are you happy to maybe name your top three in order?
Yeah, 100%. So, no surprises here. Haven't gone out on too much of a limb. Just really following current trends. I think Perth will be the top performer. But as Mike said, there is that risk, because I think the tide will turn at some point through 2024, and it's a matter of when things turn. But I'm going to stick with Perth as a top performer. I'm going to stick with Brisbane as number 2. I just think Adelaide doesn't have the economic drivers to sustain its capital growth. I mean, it's had such an amazing run for a number of years. It had an amazing run during COVID. It's kept going last year. I just don't think that's sustainable. So I have Perth 1, Brisbane 2, and I have Darwin as a smoky.
Wild card.
Wild card, yeah. And look, I think it's actually very hard to call, the worst performer. I actually couldn't put my finger on a capital city over the next 12 months with any certainty whatsoever. You could pick, Look, to be honest, I think that's grey. So I'm not gonna pick a worst performing capital city. I'm gonna stay on the fence there.
Okay. My three in order of strongest performance to number three performance, I'm going to go with Adelaide as a city that nails it. I also think that while I feel that Perth will do quite well, I think that Brisbane's got a lot of momentum, and I think also the games will continue to support that. And I'm going to have a smoky and go out on a limb and say I think regional New South Wales. And, regions range from being teeny tiny little outbacks to really big cities in their own right. But New South Wales has a couple of very big cities, or quite a few. And I think we'll see affordability constraints forcing Sydney-siders to look at alternatives. So that's what I'm going to suggest. Mike, your turn.
I think I'm going to pick Brisbane, Perth, Sydney.
In that order? In that order?
In the bingo hall, like waiting for the ball to land in your hand.
I know. I'm just kind of thinking of future me, and I'm like, I'm gonna say, why did I pick Sydney? No, I think it's I think Brisbane's first. I think Perth is going to continue to push, and I could easily flip those over. I think Sydney might surprise on sentiment, and Adelaide will be in the mix in terms of like a dark horse. I think there could be a Hobart bounce back. I mean, it's been whacked pretty hard, and it's still a relatively cheap median price, and it's such a beautiful part of the world. I think it'll do pretty well.
So you've just picked 5 capital cities so far.
Well, that was a smoke.
You've only got 3 left.
No,
let's narrow it back.
I'll take Adelaide out, right? Okay. So it was Brisbane, Perth, Sydney, with some regrets.
So Sydney's your smoky then.
Well, Sydney is my third. Like, it's in third position, but my smoky is Hobart. Or is that too
so
many?
you've gone a fourth. All right.
Do you know what? This 50%. Is probably my least favourite question on our predictions list, because it feels so fickle, and we're always talking about the importance of bringing it for the long haul. And I would never avoid buying if it was right for my strategy, if I thought that it would have a year of not performing it, in the top 3, because you need diversification. And it has to be a long play. And there are other things to consider, such as, rents and vacancy rates and how much work the property needs, how easy it is for you to get there. So I know we're having a bit of fun with it, but it's
all predictions are fickle, Cate. Yeah. The whole this whole episode's fickle.
No,
but they're one of our most popular episodes. So.
Oh no! Oh, you didn't tell me that. No,
that's it, Mike.
It does feel very silly, because I think we're kind of going against our own philosophies. Like, I've always kind of said, hot spotting is nowhere near as important as the planning. Eat your veggies and then you get your dessert sort of stuff. And people shouldn't be going, all right, where do I buy in 2024 for the best results? It's like, well, where do you buy in the next decade for the best results? That's kind of more where my head is at. But we're having some fun with this.
Yeah.
I've just got to try and relax.
1,000%. It's all good. The next question, Dave, I'll throw it back to you. What do you think will happen with investor numbers?
Look, I think they'll stay broadly consistent with which they've done mostly for the last couple of years, to be honest. I think there could be a bit of a drop. We know, anecdotally that investors, there's a number of investors selling to get out of the market, but we haven't really seen that play out in terms of the percentage of people buying. It's still sat around 65, owner occupied, 35 investors. So we might see it fall a bit, I think, but I think, not a lot if it does. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, on that note, I agree with you. It's historically been almost a perfect balance of a third, hasn't it?
Yeah.
what I think will be interesting is seeing where investors spread nationally, because we've lost a lot in Victoria and a lot of our sales are investor driven. It doesn't mean that there'll be price falls, because we've got owner occupier demand assisting our price growth, but investor appetite is definitely down. I mean, the investors that I'm dealing with are fewer in number, and they're mostly from Sydney, a couple from Brisbane, and then you get your occasional overseas investor. But it's a really grim market for us with investor count down here at the moment, because we've had a number of things that have turned investors to other states. And I think things will get a bit uglier for Melbourne on that front before they get better. We'll need some legislative change, or for the land tax to be repealed, to get people to jump back on board, because a lot of people have been talking about it negatively. I think prices for Melbourne is not necessarily a shaky, frightening thing. It's just that investor appetite and the cost of holding right now is prohibitive for some.
Yeah.
And there are other states
agree.
that are going down the same path as us. I think things will be pretty tight and pretty tough in New South Wales.
Yeah, and we'll probably touch on some of those areas with question number 5, predictions for government intervention into property markets.
Yeah, cool. Mike, what do you think about investor numbers?
I think we're probably going to continue to see some reticence from investors for good reason around state political intervention. And of course, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, we don't have a federal election next year, but we've got at least a couple of state ones, right? We've got, I think, Queensland and Victoria. Is there a Victorian one?
Don't think there's Victorian,
right,
but
okay.
there is Queensland.
Google Victoria state election.
No, I think we've still got another year, I'm pretty sure.
Every 4 years. Yeah,
maybe even 2 years.
Yeah, you just picked that Dan bloke again.
I know. You pulled the scab off that wound.
Me?
Yeah.
No, I think it's a pain lecture. I've got to constantly remind you of your errors of the past.
Yeah.
I don't really know anything about Dictator Dan apart from like the Ring of Steel and but it really just like the housing policies are just
you knew a bit about
shocking.
The golf course policy.
Yeah, love that. We got some sort of like fan mail about me making fun of his public golfing career, so that was fun to see. I think investors are turned off, right, because they're being demonized again, and it's the same old cycle. The government runs out of money, or there's a crisis. Who do we point the finger at that isn't necessarily the noisiest cohort or the dominant cohort?
Or the cohort that when we pick on them, we'll probably get some good votes.
Yeah, absolutely. But like many times I see people like tenants union, talking about, the problem is, supply, and we need more this, we need more that. And I'm just kind of like, I just shake my head. It just, I'm dumbfounded as to how the quality of this debate in Australia playing out. But I'm really, really hoping that we're probably going to have some more intervention, and it's going to be harebrained rubbish, right? There's probably a button here that I can queue up for later on.
This is our next question, Mike. So
we'll leave that one.
Why don't we just jump straight into
jump
it?
Into
then.
it.
Just
yeah.
Stay on your roll, number 5.
What's
your prediction?
What is the government?
Government intervention in the property market. What do you think they could do? Because we often talk about what they should do. But what do you think they could do?
I'll answer that seriously, but before I do that, I'm going to say that it's going to be
a complete load of shit.
Why do I have that button? That's a good question. I'm not going to answer it. What could they do? I mean, they're putting the tax on overseas investors, right? So they're probably going to look at vacancy taxes. They're probably going to look at a moratorium on rental increases over a certain value, or limit increases to a certain percent. There is a real risk that there could be rent caps, like horrible things like that. But they're going to say the problem is supply, supply, supply. We need to build, build, build. But we're not in a position to build. The government infrastructure pipeline is big. A third of construction companies are reporting vacancies. Construction costs are still high because of labour shortages. It's just not.
And
It's
we're
not
not
the right
getting enough
time.
tax revenue to roll out everything that we're promising we want to.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
relying on industry and doing these partnership deals, it's not as easy as it sounds, because industry players will be looking at something that makes economic sense. They're not in the business of doing this for altruistic reasons.
No,
which is why the government will continue to try and pull more money out of our multi-trillion-dollar super industry, and particularly the industry funds, and they'll probably tinker with laws around and taxation around to make build to rent more profitable.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's something they're going to keep trying to do. And what does that do? It means, as I've said before, it means more properties owned by big business or big super, big corporations, less by mum and dad investors. So, you know, that's something that they're going to try and do. Yeah, and that will provide more supply in the long run, but it will probably make it harder for less mums and dads own investment properties.
Yeah. And in terms of managing first home buyer opportunities, because this is an evergreen, every time we've got any kind of election promises being dreamt up, they'll always have a space for the first home buyers. I think we'll see a broader array of equity-driven initiatives, so shared equity schemes, and a greater variety of and probably more thoughtful rules around that, you know, how people can renovate, buy out the government. I think it will start to become more mainstream information, because right now most people wouldn't know the ins and outs of it, and it's a very limited scheme. But I think it's a good one.
I think you're right, and you know, there's a lot of people that kind of talk about the property market like it's too big to fail, like it'll never fail because the states rely so much on stamp duty revenue. And I hate to sound like a lefty, but just imagine if the government is a shareholder in housing with first home buyers. Like, there's even more incentive for the property market to be kind of propped up. So
Yes.
if that happens, we're going to get some criticism in that sector, I think. But I also agree with Dave. I think 2024 is going to be the rise of the corporate landlord. And I think in time, I mean, the pipeline it'll take years and years for this stuff to be built in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
But I think I predict it's not probably next year, but in the coming years, that it'll be like there'll be a conversation about, we miss being able to deal with our local property manager who just talks directly to a landlord. Now we have to be on hold for 25 minutes just to say that the tap's leaking. Like, I think we're going to have a lot of angst in and around that.
Yeah, we will. The faceless corporations and super funds that own the properties instead of the mums and dads, and, you know, your average punter who you can deal with more directly.
Yeah. And for the first home buyers as well, I think there'll be enough sort of education for people to realise the stimulatory nature of the first home buyer grant. So I think they'll lean more towards stamp duty exemptions, but also early access of super to fund deposit and things like that. I think that will likely come on the agenda.
Yeah. I don't think it will until Liberal parties are in power.
Yes. True.
But it will come. Yeah, I think that's going to come to fruition at some point down the track. I also think, you know, state-based governments will continue to target underutilised properties. I think that's just going to keep building momentum until, you know, you pretty much, if you want to own a holiday house, you know, it's going to cost you extra. It doesn't matter where it is in the country. And foreign buyers are going to continue to be targeted. I mean, ultimately, those two cohorts are probably easier targets, more palatable targets for a bigger percentage of the population, of the voters at the end of the day.
But not a meaningful percentage in terms of their impact on the property market, right?
No.
But they're an easy scapegoat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, with our ageing population, I could see our governments getting creative on how they could tax family homes, not necessarily a death tax. It could even be some kind of either initiative or also something they could get their paws on with a levy when people are selling family home and going into aged care, because that is staring us all down the barrel at the moment with the baby boomer generation. And I'm certain that with the equity that's been built up in their properties, our governments will have a look at how they can get their paws on some of that.
Yeah, it's going to be a really difficult one for a party to navigate politically at some point. So,
and as far as estates and intergenerational wealth transfer goes, there's got to be some plan that they'll be hatching to grab a piece of that as well, because we're about to see one of the greatest intergenerational wealth transfers over the next 15 years that we've seen in forever.
Yeah, there's trillions on the line, right? So there could be a few more mushroom dinners.
You know what? I went to our local cafe the other day and they had the brunch brekkie menu out, and they've renamed their mushroom and feta on toast to Psycho Killer.
Oh, gosh. I thought I was being a bit too edgy throwing it out there, and I thought you guys were going to say, no, we're going to have to edit that out. Like, that's in bad taste. But now I feel,
something that if you could get it to work logistically, using superannuation to offset, but you can't touch the money, but it sits in offset, so it reduces the interest payable on your home.
Ooh,
could be, because in essence, you're getting the return of the interest rate without paying tax on it. So that something like that, because I saw something which I reckon it was about 6 to 12 months ago, something like that, but almost, like our debt to income ratio, or how that skyrocketed over the last sort of 20 years. If you stuck all our superannuation against our debt levels would be basically the same as they were 20 years ago.
Wow.
So, like a lot of our money has been going into this space where we can't touch it.
Yeah.
And that explains some of what's happened there. But it was like quite amazing, actually, the direct correlation to the difference.
Yeah, amazing.
I was going to bring it on this podcast, but I never did. So now I have.
Now, one thing that we haven't got in our lineup, and I think it fits into government intervention in the property market, is any changes that could come from APRA or the RBA that could influence our property market outside of interest rate, cash rate movements, lending policy, or buffer rates, even looking at loan amortization extensions. What do you think, Dave?
I'll look, you could extend the loan amortization period on more loans to be, but I think people don't want to think that they're paying off their loan for any more than 30 years. And so I think they don't want to take out loans for 40 years or et cetera, even if it does make things more affordable for them.
Yeah.
The psychology of it. Look, I think, the one we've talked about, if rates do start coming down, then I think there's more of a case, and the economy is really slowing down, for APRA to consider reducing the buffer from being 3% above the rate you're paying
to 2.5%.
Say 2.5%.
Yeah, like bites us back 0.5% worth of serviceability, which is considerable. It's what people were good for 2 rate increases ago.
Yeah.
1% would be nice.
Yeah, wouldn't it?
But they're not going to do that with inflation above the target band, I think. Or at least, like, let's say that it's sitting at 3.8%, but it's galloping down lower. Then they might look at it, but they risk kind of like a 2-speed economy, where if they reduce that buffer now, the property market could really pump a lot of extra stimulus into inflation. So I think they're going to hold off.
Noting 2/3 of people, 2/3 of adults don't have a mortgage. I think we get so hung up on the impact of a rate increase across society when the reality is not everyone is impacted by it. And we've seen that in the data of late really wealthy people and retirees and those who have paid off their home, they're having a great time.
Yeah. There was a guy in the newspaper that went on record saying, "I hope interest rates go to 20%." And I thought, oh, dude, like, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. But like, there's a lot of people that probably will now make like a little voodoo doll with your face on
Yeah,
it.
that's
Because of
right.
course he's just got probably cash in the bank. He's like, term deposits, they haven't been a thing for like 3 years. Like now I've got 8 of them. Yeah. They are humming along in this
They are
inflationary
indeed.
environment.
Yeah, I dropped my
Yeah.
parents off at Station Pier on the weekend. I was like, ugh,
Always
what
back
a thing to do.
self-interest in any race.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, moving on to the next one. Mike, this is right up your alley. Developers and building.
Yeah. I think what's very, very clear is the pipeline of high density residential has markedly dropped. It's normally sitting around about 50% of resi, and it's about 15%. So if you talk about increasing supply, it's for the same reason why we don't like to invest in areas where there's an apartments. Is like suddenly you might buy an apartment and suddenly there could be 500 pop up in the same sort of walking distance, right? So housing affordability would definitely be fixed by an increase in apartment construction, but the pipeline of it's just not there. The risk reward ratio for developers just isn't there, and you know, in a high interest rate environment where they're funding these projects, it's just not making a lot of sense. So I think that we're going to struggle with construction. I think construction costs, definitely the materials have come right down, but there's some structural issues with the way that we're supplying things like timber. Like we've lost a lot of the timber that takes 20 years to come to maturity during bushfires and things like that hasn't necessarily been replaced. What we desperately need is innovation. And we need to be able to cut the programs down. There was a LinkedIn post that I put out that the New South Wales Building Commissioner sort of had a go at me as a representative of quantity surveyors, talking about how, well, you know, the construction time frame to build something hasn't dropped in like 70 years. But I was able to retort with that, was saying, well, you know, the amount of people dying on site because of no safe work methods and those sorts of things has decreased markedly. So that's the payoff, right? Things are safer because we've got to tick those health and safety boxes. There's another big box that not a lot of people have been talking about, and that's embodied carbon. And that's going to come across the country in terms of, if you're building something, you're going to need a report with your development application to state how much carbon is created in the manufacturing of those materials. And that is going to slow down the pipeline. Already it's becoming a problem here in New South Wales.
I think that's a great example of how red tape, regulation, bureaucracy slows things down and slows the economy down. That often occurs in all sorts of industries. I know it's significant, say in the mortgage broking industry, but people don't see it unless you're like directly involved with it. You don't really understand what the red tape is, and that's where there's that fine line, that balance between, particularly a wealthy nation like we are, where we start to try and protect everything and make everything extremely safe, and you know, but it does come at a cost, and that's you know, this is an example of the cost, isn't it? I mean, it is a contributing factor to the undersupply of new properties. I do think governments are going to try and find ways to provide greater tax breaks to developers. So
they'll have to.
They need to. So I think, you know, we actually could be entering a new sort of golden age, to be honest, for developers, I think, because there's no other place to go really to create that supply. It is absolutely necessary because vacancy rates are so low. And what else can you do if it's not profitable, or it's much harder to make a buck? We're just not going to be building enough properties. So the government has to change the rules to make it more profitable. So I think it could be becoming a very good time to be a developer. and for those who are already really successful and know what they're doing
and can get access to finance.
Yeah.
I think if we consider, small residential boutique builders, I think that things will look up for renovators who are trying to chase builders. We've obviously had, after we had that initiative during COVID, with the home builder grants, builders' pipelines were just extended out and they were pricing things out, and it got really hard to find a builder. And of course, we had the materials shortage and increased cost to deal with. But we also lost a lot of our builders to infrastructure projects because the money's good. I mean, I can speak firsthand. My stepson's a chippy. He's working on the rail, and he's not doing carpentry on the rail. He's working night shift, and it's a very different field for him now. And it was purely because the money was better. And we've got all these big builds going on around Melbourne, but we're not the only state that's got a lot of infrastructure projects running. I think when Brisbane's games are sorted out, they too will probably have builders returning to work.
It's a great analogy, isn't it? And it's something that they've only really started talking about significantly as a contributor to inflation, is all the infrastructure money that we're spending or we've promised to spend, and now all the governments have got some pressure to pull back on them, and they've tinkered a bit, but they probably need to pull back even further until inflation's back in the target band. But then it's also impacting the developers' ability to have staff, and then we're changing the rules to make it easier to bring in the right people from overseas to fill the jobs we don't have, except for tradies.
And the unions are definitely blocking that, right? And that's a whole nother episode.
It is indeed. Now, in the interest of
this whole topic is an episode, isn't it?
It is. Now, we've our clock's ticking, but we've got a couple to nut through still. I'm going to band interest rates and inflation together and get you to chat about your prediction, Dave.
Okay, so if I start with interest rates, I think there's a possibility we'll have one more rate rise, and I think there's a possibility there'll be no rate reductions next year, but I think at the outer limit, there'll be up to 2 rate reductions. I think inflation, getting it down to that final sort of 2 to 3% still might be slightly harder than a lot of people think. And I know the share markets have gone gangbusters in the last sort of month or so, with the Fed Reserve and Jay Powell, I think, coming out and saying that she thinks, Jerome Powell, is it? Coming out and saying that they think rates are likely the next move will be down, etc. But we've got to keep in mind that the US, New Zealand, and UK and Canada are around 1% higher than we are currently. So, and we've been further behind on the inflation. We started rising later, and we started falling later as well. So, in terms of inflation, I think it's going to keep coming down, but we may not actually hit the target band or within that target band across a quarter until the back end of the year. And I think they're going to be loath. Look, they often will pull rates down or reduce rates slightly earlier to get ahead of the game. But, so I think by the end of the year, we'll be back inside the target band of 2 to 3%. And I think, but interest rates, broadly speaking, are going to be very similar to where they are today.
Okay. I've got a short view on this one, but I don't think we've got any more rate increases coming our way. I think it will be static for a large part of the year next year. And I do predict that things will calm down with inflation, and I think it will happen reasonably quickly as well. And they'll then be looking at how they can stimulate things. That's my best guess.
We've got a lot less RBA meetings in 2024, and I'm just eight of them. Just checking the dates. So we've got February, March, May, June, August, September, November, December. So
April, July, and October are the months off.
Yeah, right.
And Jan.
So could there be another rate rise? I think there probably could, but I don't suspect that there will be. And I think we might end up getting a cut in the August meeting. But like, what an absurdly specific time. Like, I'm just throwing that out there in case it happens and I look like an absolute genius. And then otherwise, I just hope everyone
Forgets
forgets.
it.
I think we'll, yeah, look, I don't know if we'll hit the target band next year. I think it's still probably going to be a 2025 thing unless globally things change. But I expect that there will be a cut next year. And at the end of the day, remember, we're talking about this soft landing. So we can't just go like, bang, we're in the band and then cut. We are going to have to moderate on the way down.
You'd like to think so.
Yes.
Okay, rents and vacancy rates.
So I think vacancy rates will stay at a similar levels, unfortunately. We might see a slight uptick, but they're going to stay pretty similar around record lows. Rental growth, I think will outstrip capital growth. So we'll continue to see yields increasing, gross yields increasing for investors, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, who have been historically the lowest by a significant margin. So, that's my overview.
I feel that we'll have a lot of pressure on rents, particularly in Victoria, and we've still been working at double-digit growth year on year. I don't see that changing, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Victoria, just because of the political situation, and if any other state goes in that direction, they're going to have the same sort of thing. I think we'll probably start to see Perth moderate with rents, just given the sheer amount of investor interest over there and the transactions. I don't think we'll see a pace of rental growth like we did in 2023. I think the vacancies, like Dave says, is going to stay the same. I think capital growth and rental growth will probably be fairly close together, which normally doesn't happen, right? Rental growth normally underperforms capital growth by a long, long margin. So it is saying a lot to say they'll be in concert. I know you said they'll be a little bit more. I just think that people will only be able to take so much and then they'll change their behaviors. They'll stay living with their parents for longer. They'll get a flatmate. I think the household formation rate will change markedly. I think we're going to see more people per dwelling, and immigrants tend to have more people per dwelling than, I don't know what the other word is, people that are citizens. And we've seen a huge influx in migration, and they're all going to rent mostly to start with. Even the ones that are in a position to buy probably won't for a little while until they get settled. So I think, we're going to see that household formation rate nudging up towards 3.
I think we'll see a proliferation of granny flats and
townhouses.
Or not necessarily, but though you can get them through planning a lot easier. It might be like a container that gets through the council approval system a little easier, and you've got families living in your backyard. I think we'll see a lot more of that. You can already spot these ads on social media if you look for them. Kits that are easy to put up or completely some
like a complying development or something like that, just to sneak it through without too much red tape.
Yeah. People live in garages, lofts.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. If I put a number on it, I'll just say rental growth in the 5 to 8% band, something around that sort of range, 6 to 9%. Slightly outstripping capital growth anyway. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to sales volumes.
So I think listings, we'll see listings continue to rise in 2024. I think it'll be above the 5-year average. And so that'll put pressure on price growth into 2024. And we know that rate rises have a lag effect of usually about 12 to 18 months. So I think we're going to see some of the pain come out in the economy and really play out in 2024. I think that's going to be the COVID hangover year, 2024. So we're going to see higher sales volumes.
Interesting. I predict that we'll have high sales volumes in the first quarter, and by mid-year they'll be lower than the 5-year average.
Mm-hmm. Why are you saying that for mid-year?
I think we'll see a glut of stock hit in the early year, and when vendors don't get what they want, They shut up shop.
Yeah.
They don't list. So when listing activity slows down, it doesn't matter what the buyer appetite is, there's not enough volume for them to soak up.
I sort of think on similar lines. There'll be opportunities. There'll be people that have held off getting things ready for the new year. The prices won't perform as well as people's expectations, because we can already see that in the core logic data. The pace of growth is slowing, and then people yank things off the market. If that coincides with an interest rate drop, we're going to see a couple of listings sell above what people think market is, and then I think we might get a little bit of a flurry of activity in the back end of the year.
Yeah, makes sense. Now we have one last thing to talk about before we say cheerio, and that is risks which could impact the market.
The biggest risk that I think about is that we're all completely wrong, or you guys are exactly on the money and I've biffed everything. That is a sincerely worrying risk.
That would be
But I think it's
hilarious.
political. I think political's the number one risk to perverting the market.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where I often, top one year, I think I predicted Russia would invade Ukraine, and things
China
like,
would invade Taiwan.
well, I spoke about that in an episode.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, so I think, the big picture risks, the American US election 2024, I think,
Yeah.
Donald Trump getting re-elected and then gutting the major institutions in the US and, gradually changing laws so the US becomes he becomes essentially a benevolent dictator. That's the biggest risk to anyone who believes in democracy. I think, Russia, Western democracies stop funding Ukraine, and Russia essentially overpowers Ukraine and wins that war. Again, is a real risk to democracies around the world and a real fillip to the autocrats and the dictators. And, these things aren't going to be positive for the world economy. Obviously the Israel-Hamas war dragging on and bringing in other players, if you like, is a real risk as well. So they're on a global macro level, what I see is the big risks that can then flow down to little old Australia and our property market.
I've got an interesting one that's been troubling me, and that is the effect of natural disasters domestically on our insurance and the flow-on effect for investor selection and also where people are choosing to live, because we all want to know that we're fully insured if we're taking out an insurance policy, and we don't want to pay a crippling price for it. And I think that will have an impact on markets that are exposed to flood risk and obviously bushfire risk but broadly rising sea levels and flood. I'm fearful about how that will shape our market nationally.
I think you're really right to be fearful about that, and because there are certain parts of the country that are they're uninsurable properties, and they're not all the quintessential floodplain. 2 years ago it went to the roof style things. It's just sometimes the risk appetite's just not there. I mean, like the old timber pubs that are on the corner of every country town are basically uninsurable these days. It's a worry. I really think there needs to be some inquiry into that, and the natural disasters. I mean, we know that Mother Nature is getting angrier and angrier, and that flows into building and construction as well, because the money is in the rectification works for insurance. Because if you think about, let's say Dave's roof blows off, he has to be put up into a hotel, and Dave is sort of guy that likes the finer things, that premium
roof.
Roof. Yeah, he's a stickler for roofs, and he loves that premium grade talcum powder as well, right? So that's going to cost the insurance company a lot of money. So they're going to be headhunting the tradies to be able to fix it as soon as possible.
Yeah,
Yeah, look, yeah, it's going to put pressure on the economy broadly, which is obviously going to mean people have less money, reduce our standard of living, and that's going to mean less money will flow into the property market. I think something I've thought for a while that isn't really talked about with climate change is actually what you've alluded to there is the impact of wind and greater strength wind. And I think of it, you get stronger gusts of wind or, whenever you have larger changes in weather. And if climate change does play out where, part of what climate change will provide is greater fluctuations in the temperature, which will mean stronger wind, which will create havoc. And that's actually, often the worst time to be outside is not when the temperature's warmer or colder, but it's actually when it's really windy. And I don't know, but anecdotally, you certainly notice it seems to be windier more often around here. You hear of more trees falling down on roofs and etc. So, it's that would be very costly because it possibly will do more damage than flooding.
Well, on that cheery note,
what a way to finish!
That's a wrap.
Everything's gone to hell.
We've nailed it. Whether we've got it right or not, the proof will be in the pudding in 12 months' time. And I'm very much looking forward to going through our predictions, and I'm going to give Pete a buzz and see if we can get him back on the show for that one.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Well, it's been really good to see you too.
You too.
Oh, well, eat, drink and be merry and be safe, and look forward to seeing you on the other side.
100%. Have a great
Take
time,
care.
everyone.